Why are we importing so much as a country? Why are our onions coming from Tanzania? Why is our wheat coming from Russia? Why is our sugar coming from Brazil? One of the leaders in West Africa, he says, he who feeds you controls you. And that is so true. In the 90s, if you remember, IMF was a big player in Kenya during the Moi days and in Africa. And most people lost jobs, many companies were cancelled. And that's the time African leaders said, we are tired of the West. We are going to China, we're going to face East.
Is the business environment friendly to foreign investors?
The challenge I think companies are starting to have is our taxation system seems to be a bit challenging, not only just in terms of you paying to government as a business, but also how it's affecting your customers. So if you own a nice restaurant here in Westlands, yes, your obligations to government are going up, but also the customers who are coming, they're coming maybe 30% less. And this is the big thing that Kibaki tried to solve when he came into power. He really reduced interest rates on government securities. At that point, T-bills were going for 1%, 2%, 3%.
We've moved from 1% to 18%.
Absolutely. If you look at somebody like Gaddafi had what is called the Green Booklet, and he was giving free seedlings to citizens. He was giving free farm utensils, and you saw how Gaddafi, ended up. You, Lynn, cannot provide me justice.
Absolutely.
You cannot provide me law and order.
Yes.
You need a policeman, you need a judge. So government should be involved with the things that the private sector cannot provide. These are called public goods, making sure the markets are clean. No private sector can do that. So there are other entities, the other remaining functions. Ask, these things can be done by the private sector. Housing. Most Kenyans have said, we can actually do housing ourselves. Just give us good jobs.
Hey guys, welcome to today's episode of LNS. My name is Lynn Ngugi, and as always, we get to meet for another thought-provoking conversation. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who is saying, there's no enough money circulating in the environment. Pesa iko wapi? Why are businesses closing down? Well, the narrative by the president and his team is that we are actually doing good. Kenya is doing good, and we are bound to do more. So who is lying and who is telling the truth? I'm happy that we get to have a guest here who is going to break it down for us and finally tell us how we are doing. And I always say it's a moment to learn and relearn things that we have been taught before. I'm about to let him introduce himself so that he can walk us through this conversation. But before I do that, of course, I have to say thank you so much to our partners at Kings Developers Limited. I do not take our partners for granted. So I've said before, if you're looking into owning a home with an ISO certified company, a real estate company, why don't you try my people at Kings Developers Limited? I know things are tough, but they have a very flexible payment plan and they have everything for everyone. Upper end, medium range, even affordable. Just walk to their magnificent building at Prism Towers or call them, the numbers on the screen, and ask them, Kings, what do you have for us? And also to say thank you so much to our amazing subscribers. You've gotten us to 1.1 million subscribers. Man, I don't take that for granted. And remember, if you are watching this and you've not subscribed, please consider subscribing. It's absolutely free and it goes a long way into making sure that our work reaches a huge audience. And also to thank the team that gets to put this work together. I've always said you get to see me in front of the camera, but it takes an entire team to be able to put this together. And of course, now without further ado, please allow me to let my guest today introduce himself. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on your show.
Karibu sana. It's an honor to have you. And as I was saying, I was introducing, I don't take an opportunity to sit with an expert who is going to educate us. I don't take it for granted. But before we go on, anyone who has not maybe seen you or maybe who is familiar with you, but they would love you to introduce yourself, would you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Ken Gishinga. I'm the chief economist at Mentoria Economics. This is a company I founded about 10 years ago, and our work is to advise clients, mostly fund managers, investors, on the state of the economy, helping them make strategic insights on the economy. Prior to that, I was in the banking sector where I served as an economist for a number of years. And before that, I lived in the United States. I was in Seattle, Washington, where I was an analyst with Microsoft, helping them to look at their supply chains, their global supply chains. My education background is I have a Harvard degree, an economics degree from Harvard University. My focus at Harvard was on the work of Joseph Schumpeter. This is really an Austrian professor who moved to the US to focus on the work of entrepreneurship. So I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, and this is an area that I'm very excited about. Thank you.
Beautiful. That's quite a portfolio right there. And you know, or before we started recording, we were saying it's a good time to be a Kenyan. We are paying attention to things we normally used to ignore. We are paying attention to our economy. We are paying attention to our leaders. We are holding them accountable. How does it feel to see this happening in our country?
And it's very exciting. And I've always said Kenya's history moves in cycles of 30 years. If you go back to the 1890s, that's when the British were coming into Kenya to build the railway line. It took about 30 years till the 1920s, 1930s, before Africans started resisting colonial rule. That's the era of Harry Thuku, the era of that generation. Now then it took another 30 years in the 1960s for Kenya to get independence.
Yeah.
So there we are looking at the Jaramogi Oginga, we're looking at Jomo Kenyatta. Yeah. So for that generation, it was about Kenya getting political independence. If you go into another 30 years, you talk about the 1990s. Now it was about multi-party politics. So this is a time of Kenneth Matiba, Moise, Martha Karua. And for that generation, it was about pluralism. How do we have multiple parties? And if you add another 30 years, it takes us to the 2020s.
Now.
And the concern of this generation, it's not about political independence, we have that. It's not about pluralism, we have that. It's about jobs. It's about the economy. And I always said the winner of 2022 elections has to focus almost entirely, exclusively on elections, on the economy, because the generation coming out wants to understand, why am I graduating with a degree in actuarial science, I'm not getting a job? Why am I top of my class at a good university and I'm not getting a job? So the leaders have to craft strategies to increase jobs, because the population is increasing, but the opportunities are not. Unfortunately, that's not happening, and that's why it's the talk of the town right now.
The population is increasing, but the opportunities are not. So where does this leave a country? If this continues for the next 10 years, what do you think would happen to this country?
You know, we talk about the demographic dividends, that Kenya is a young country. The median age is about 19 years. So these are young people in college, in universities. And if they are taken care of, they'll be the next level of consumers. That's why the big brands want to come to Africa.
Yes.
The McDonald's, the KFCs. But if you don't put in strategies, that demographic dividend can become a demographic time bomb, where you have a lot of people graduating, a lot of people idle on the streets, very smart, so they can hack into your banking systems.
Yes.
They're idle, and they can actually cause insecurity issues. I mean, you saw what happened on June 25th with the Gen Z strike. So that demographic dividends can easily become a time bomb if you don't create good economic policies that foster business growth and employment.
Okay. As I was doing my intro, I stated that the president is saying our economy is actually doing very well. Is that the truth, or is that a lie?
Well, if you look at what they stated, they talked about the exchange rate, which has been stable. That is true. If you look at the exchange rate reserves in the central bank, it's at an all-time high. If you look at inflation, it's actually even below the target. So from that perspective, they said things are not so bad. But what really makes an economy attractive or not? It's really about employment. You can have all the macroeconomic indicators, but if people are unemployed, if our poverty levels are hitting 40%, it does not matter whether it's GDP growth. If people are losing jobs, it's very difficult to convince them. And that's what's happening right now, where companies are not making the revenue they used to make. So they have to let go of people. People are unemployed. And obviously that pains. So the number one indicator of whether an economy is functioning or not is unemployment. And that's in the United States. If you look at the elections,
Yeah.
it was the biggest talking point. Inflation and unemployment are the two most important. They're actually related. We call it the Phillips curve in economics. It's the two most important indicators in economics. You can achieve all the other things. You can have a good exchange rate. You can have enough reserves at the central bank. But if companies are laying off people, if people are not spending, if purchasing power is weak, then definitely what the Catholic bishop said, that actually we are in a difficult situation, is actually true.
So the number one indicator is unemployment.
Absolutely. Inflation and unemployment.
Inflation and unemployment.
Correct.
What would be the second indicator?
Then you want to look at growth, now GDP growth. The only problem with GDP growth, if you look at Kenya's GDP growth, it's highly driven by the public sector. So public spending on standard gauge railway, on roads, but doesn't tell you about private sector, which is where most Kenyans are in the private sectors. Right here, you are in the private sector. So it can give you a false illusion on your 5% growth, but you don't really dissect to see where that growth is coming from. And I think they should start telling us what percent of this is public sector, what percentage of this is private sector. But I can tell you, private sector growth, most businesses I talk to have revenues about 30% below what they had last year on year. So it tells you the private sector is doing very poorly. And if you've lost 30% of your business and your margins were in that industry was at 30%, it means you're almost heading into lost territory now.
Oh, so if I was an investor right now and I come to you, Ken, because you give this advice and you consult on these matters, and I say, Ken, I want to put up a business in Kenya, what would that answer look like right now?
Well, we do have the statistics that come from the government. What we do know is Kenya is a very strong service-based economy, where services such as this thrive. Actually, if you look at areas such as ICT, if you look at accommodation and food and accommodation, those segments are doing well. But sectors like manufacturing are really struggling. Agriculture depends on the rain and the weather. The good thing we have in Kenya is we are not like other African countries that are very dependent on natural resources. If you go to countries like Zambia, it's about the copper industry. If you go to Angola, it's about aluminum. The good thing about Kenya, we are service driven. So that even if you lose an opportunity in one sector, let's say you're among the G4S people who are let go as an accountant, you can quickly pivot into a fast food chain where you're an accountant. So services drive our Kenyan economy, and it's because our human capital is quite strong. So the inability to take advantage of our human capital to the point where we're even exporting labor, I think is a sign that we're not actually getting our economic priorities right.
What prevents then the private sector from blooming?
It's about money supply. It's really about how much money they access. So to make it simple, I'll paint a picture of how the economy looks like.
Yes.
Think of a homestead that has 3 houses. The first house is where we live as citizens. You and I, everybody in this room. We consume, we need food, we need housing, we need clothing. So call that house A. House B is now government itself. Its work is to provide services to you, roads, transport, security. Then house 3 is the banking sector that's supposed to provide you with loans. So these 3 are the 3 houses that almost make up an economy. And we need services from both. So the government will provide you with what are called public goods. It will provide you with good roads. It will provide you with law and order. If you need to access justice, you can go to the courts. Those are public goods. The banks will provide you with loans and
the credit.
The credit. So you can buy your private goods. You can buy your mortgage. You can get your car loan. You can go for your MBA loan. Now, the challenge we're having right now is both of these entities are pulling us in different directions.
The banks and the government.
Exactly. No, the banks have very high interest rates. Yes, a couple have started reducing in the last 1 week, but still we are looking at 17, 18%.
Yeah.
The government, again, is pulling in terms of taxes. So if you look at your paycheck, if you're earning 100,000 shillings and you already have a facility with a bank, so not only are you now having more deductions from taxes, your SHIF now and NSSF will go up in January to 6%.
Wait, what?
Oh yes, be prepared for that. Then the banks are demanding their pound of flesh. They are 17% interest rate. So you have these two entities drawing a lot from you to the point where you don't have purchasing power. You can't go and demand for goods and services. You can't spend the way you used to spend, maybe on restaurants, on clothing, maybe luxury items. Your demand has gone down. And that's why these businesses that depended on you now are shutting down because you're not frequenting them as you used to. So it's really about those two spheres. We focus a lot on the government, but we don't focus a lot on the banks, and they play a critical role. So the solution has to be reducing interest rates, the banks, and the government also reducing taxes so that you as a mwananchi have enough money to go and really be a participator in the economy.
So where would you place the banks at this point? And are there any regulations that should be put in place to make sure that they are serving public interest and not government's interests?
Well, that's a big conversation right now because the interest rates have been quite high. And their argument has been inflation historically was quite high and interest rates had to be high. But inflation has come down significantly. We are 2.7, but those banks really have not reduced. The central bank tries to appeal to them, and that's the difference between the central bank in Kenya versus the Federal Reserve in the US. The Federal Reserve, once it slashes interest rates, overnight, your mortgage payments come down, your car loan payments come down. In Kenya, it now depends on the bank. They decide, should we? In fact, they say they go into a brainstorming session.
Oh, the banks?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, the CBK has called the banks to go into a brainstorm. But it shouldn't work like that. If CBK reduces interest rates, all the banks, the way they increase it when CBK increases is the way they should reduce it. So we also need to appeal to the banking sector to start reducing interest rates because the CBK has already reduced it for them. They also need to pass it on to the customers. So some banks have started, but still it's a bit delayed. And even the amount that they've reduced is not the amount that CBK reduced for them. So there needs to be a bit more honesty also within the banking sector in terms of how do we reduce this. Otherwise, non-performing loans as we speak are at the highest level in 18 years. You just have to open a newspaper today and see the amount of auctions taking place. It's telling you people can't keep up with the payments and they're being auctioned very frequently. So it tells you that liquidity is tight, businesses don't have that latitude. So banks have to start reducing interest rates so that at least people have a bit more money left in their pockets. And when businesses have money, they can start hiring people. But if they are paying very high, 17, 18, 19,
all the way to 24
20%.
for unsecured loans.
Absolutely. I know banks that do that. And now the microfinance, the mobile apps, now that's almost like a wild, wild west. They can actually charge you much more. So if you look at Uganda, last week, Uganda actually drew the line and said, this is a limit that we can't go beyond. These microfinances are extracting. This is actually what we call usury, where you start charging excessive interest rates. So Uganda last week drew the line and said, no, we need to bring some sanity to this. Otherwise, these lenders will run amok. I think Kenya needs to reflect on how to regulate, not really put interest rate caps, because I know that's also a big debate, but to first define what is usury. In America, they have usury laws that prevent you from charging a certain level of interest. And I think we need to have those so that banks start serving the people, start lending to you.
Okay. As we close on the bank, allow me to ask, there's been this conversation that the banks are in bed with the government when it comes to loans, right? Because I know the government has to borrow. So obviously sometimes it borrows from the banks in terms of the bonds, all these things. Is that true?
That actually is very true. The biggest government has been borrowing significantly from the banking sector. And that's why banks have been very not keen on lending to the private sector because if they lend to government, that's considered almost risk-free. And government interest rates have been very high. T-bills and bonds have been 17, 18%. So think about it this way. Why would a bank want to lend to NTTB when they can get 17, 18% risk-free?
Risk-free.
And this is the big thing that Kibaki tried to solve when he came into power. He really reduced interest rates on government securities. At that point, T-bills were going for 1%, 2%, 3%.
We've moved from 1% to 18%.
Absolutely. Actually, if you look at interest rates over the last 20 years, it's a straight line up. And because interest rates on government securities were so low, banks had no other option but to lend to the private sector. And I. And that's why you always hear people saying, oh, we miss the Kibaki days. There used to be so much money in the economy because banks were willing to lend. They could not make any money from government, so they had to make money from you and I. And that time, banks were falling over themselves. All you needed to show was a pay slip or any form of income, and a bank would give you a facility. Now you move towards today to a point where banks are getting 16, 17% from government. There's absolutely no incentive to be able to lend to the private sector. And that's why the private sector has been contracting and really struggling.
Man, isn't that a cartel though? Isn't that a secret cartel running, That's actually, it's wrong.
And that's why prudent fiscal policy is very important. Government has to be able to understand how much are we borrowing? What are we borrowing to do? Because it's that borrowing, that deficit that leads to the crowding out of that phenomenon where the private sector is ignored. It's called the crowding out effect. So good fiscal policy means, and Kibaki's first year, by the way, there was actually no borrowing. They ran a surplus where the tax revenue is actually more than the expenditure. That was probably the last year that we've ever seen that happening. So limited government borrowing means actually interest rates come down, and now banks focus on the purpose that they were formed to what's called intermediation, getting your deposits and lending to another business. That's the reason banks were set up. You take deposits from person A and make a loan for person B, and the economy grows. But the point where you're getting deposits from person A and lending to government, it means those three houses I talked about in the homestead,
yes,
they have forgotten their roles.
What would be the alternatives to banking? Because I'm sitting here now as a private citizen. Of course, I'm a member of a bank, but now I'm like, why do I belong in a bank in the first place? What role does a bank play? Because if you want credit loans, it takes like forever to be able to get that. So as wananchis, do we have alternatives to bank? Where else can we go and put our money? Because what's the essence of us putting our money in sufuria yenye sisi tutawaichukua? They take our money, they make interest using our money, but they will never benefit the private mwananchi. So what would be the alternatives?
Well, first of all, banks still have a very important use. They allow you to make payments. They allow you to receive money. For example, on your mobile banking app, it's easy to receive money, send money. So they still help in terms of facilitating movement of money. But you're absolutely right. The core purpose of making loans has kind of, in a way, reduced because of high government interest. And a lot of people now start looking at things such as SACCOs and microfinances, which also have their own challenges. Sometimes they have governance challenges. One good thing about banks is they have strong governance. Because of the Central Bank of Kenya, they have a very strong regulator. Sometimes you may find the SACCOs don't enjoy that level of governance. So yes, you could get your loan quickly, but are your deposits
safe?
So you find that's why people still want to interact. But I think there's still a future for banks. If banks invest in fintech, banks help people make payments faster and help people access credit at affordable rates, like with the mortgage scheme that the government has partnered with. Banks can continue still to play a very powerful role, but there has to be good regulation, because without regulation, definitely there's a lot of incentive to act otherwise.
Let's talk about money circulation, both in banks and in the public, people are saying there is no money circulating. Where is the money? I saw a lot of people on X tweeting and asking, where is the money? There is also a conversation going on that even the banks don't have the money. Even the banks, the ninis are empty. And that's why you will find a bank will send you maintenance texts. They are undergoing maintenance for like a whole, I was like, why is it that every time you get a text, we are going through maintenance? Kwani, how much maintenance do you have to do? Is it that you don't want us to access our money? Because it has actually increased. The text you get for maintenance, it's crazy. So I'm actually thinking, na kama ni pesa yetu mtaki to access, na kama ni pesa yetu mnafanyisha nayo biashara, so we access it tomorrow. Because even they are becoming unreliable. So anyway, let me go back to the conversation. So why is it that when we say there is not enough money circulating, what are we talking about and what's the source? Could you walk us through that?
Absolutely, and it's tied to what I said a few minutes ago. It's really about the consumer, the individual, and his paycheck. Let's talk about somebody who's employed and somebody who's in the informal space. The person who's employed has a paycheck and most probably even has a loan on that paycheck. So if the interest rates are high, it means his loan commitments to the bank are high. And if the taxes and deductions, SHIF and SSF are also high, and payee, it means also his obligations to the government is high. So if you remove that, somebody earning 100,000, you might find what they're left with is quite minimal. And that's why people tell you, we don't have money in our pockets. Yes, find somebody's earning 1 million shillings, but what he takes home is about 600,000 shillings. Then there's also another element of, we have a high unemployment rate in Kenya. So one employed person is supporting
like
a number of people, not just one household, but a number of people. In fact, there was a shocking statistic that came out a few weeks ago that said less than 1% of bank accounts in Kenya have more than 500,000 shillings. And think of all the big CEOs around Nairobi, the big shots who earn millions. And in those accounts, you'd imagine that they're loaded.
Yes.
But you'll find even one CEO who's earning 1 million shillings after tax, after school fees, then supporting the family, the extended family. He's probably just left with very little. So only 1% of bank accounts are left, only have about more than 500,000. That should shock you. That should tell you even the people you perceive
as rich
are actually supporting so many people. The dependency ratio is so high that even what's left for them is actually very minimal. And people get surprised. They say, oh, this person is a big shot. They should be spending much more, but they don't understand the obligation. So those are the things that make people say the circulation of money is not. The government has taken out its chunk, the banks have taken it. So the people can't really purchase what the things they would have wanted. That's why people start looking for cheaper substitutes as they move forward.
Okay, so if there is not enough money circulating, how is unga cheap then? Or is this what is it called? Like, why is it that then tutasema mafuta imepungua, unga imepungua, and there is no money? How does that work?
Well, I think for the food products, you have to look at, for agriculture sector, it depends on a couple of things. Number one, it's the rainfall patterns. If you have good rainfall patterns, then you'll have an abundance of produce. And we saw it during COVID. A lot of people lost jobs. People went to farming. The rains came, and food prices. Actually, the agriculture sector during COVID did very well because that's all people could do when they're not in their offices. So that production side, when there's good production, prices typically come down. But when there's minimal production, that's where the food sector has done reasonably okay because subsidies have helped. But normally it's the rain that has made more and more people come in. And that's the best cure for inflation. We talk about controlling inflation using interest rates. That's not the best because there are two types of inflation, Lynn. This one is called demand pull inflation. This is what we'd call almost a good type of inflation. This is when you get a pay rise, he gets a pay rise, I get a pay rise, and we're all going to the same coffee shop downstairs. The lady in the coffee shop says, oh, the guys upstairs seem to be are doing well, I'm going to increase
Yes.
prices on coffee because people are doing well. So that's called the demand pull. The second type is called cost push. This is actually driven by external factors coming in. So you have Russia, Ukraine, they're in a war, so the cost of wheat goes up. Israel and Hamas are in a war, the cost of fuel goes up. So it has nothing to do with our prosperity. It has everything to do with outside events. And the challenge you're having right now is the interest rates that central bank comes to control inflation. They're very good for demand pull, but they can't control events happening outside of the country. So we end up with this situation where you're trying to cure things that have gone up because of international events using tools that are local, and that creates a confusion. The best cure for inflation is productivity, making farmers produce more. So if wheat prices in Ukraine have gone up, we should come back to Kenya and say, we have a lot of land in Narok. Why do we have to import 95% of our wheat from abroad when you have good land in Narok that we can plow? Our onions come from Tanzania, but how much land is between here and Namanga that we can actually grow? So for me, the best cure for inflation is productivity. Asking, why are we importing so much as a country? Why are our onions coming from Tanzania? Why is our wheat coming from Russia? Why is our sugar coming from Brazil? When all these things
we have Mumia sugar now. Oh man.
By the way, very fertile land in Kenya.
Why is it? I have always wanted to ask this question and I'm glad you are here. So mbona tusitumie hii shamba? Kwani what could go wrong if we took the government land between here and Namanga and tupande onions? Kwani, how complicated is that process? I've always wondered how complicated it would be. We have a lot of unused land in this country.
Well, it's not complicated, but it's now gets into what is called political economy. And what do I mean by that? There are certain interests that are keen on importing. For example, you are running for office. You promise me if you get into office, I'll have an import license to buy sugar, to buy wheat. And that type of importation is the easiest way to become a billionaire in Kenya, because all you have to do is get an order, go buy, and the margins are simple. So if I'm importing wheat, why would I want to see local production in Kenya? It's actually a threat to me as an importer. Okay. So that goes back to the political economy, exactly. Not only cartels, where people have big import licenses to import rice and sugar. And as I said, this is the fastest way in Kenya. You become a billionaire overnight. You just get an order from the Kenya National Trading Company or any other entity, go and meet a supplier in Brazil. Literally, the bank will finance all your activities and you become a billionaire. So because of this ability, why would I want to see local production going on? Why? Because local production now means there's less demand for importation. And that's why in Kenya, imports always around the corner. Here there's a shortage, and within a few weeks, already a ship is coming with more than enough coming in. So it's the political economy of the agriculture sector, and that is at the heart of our challenge as a country. We need to fix that. We need to empower, and it's not just Africa. Kenya, it's Africa. If you look at somebody like Gaddafi had what is called the Green Booklet, and he was giving free seedlings to citizens. He was giving free farm utensils, and you saw how Gaddafi, ended up. So this whole idea of, and Africa is the most arable, has the most arable land. So we have to fix the political economy so that people can start growing. In fact, right now it's terrible. Now we are getting more and more regulations that make it harder for you to be a farmer. You have to be registered in Body A. So it's a frustration.
We are almost vaccinating our cows. Like, what is going on, Ken?
So it's interest. So corporate interests are huge and they override the common good. And that's where good governance has to come in to say, yes, the corporates bring in innovation, they bring in R&D, but it can't be that, your seeds are actually controlled by external entity, that you can't have your own. It was one of the leaders in West Africa. He says, he who feeds you controls you. And that is so true. So we have to protect our ag sector, because that is the mainstay. If you go to America, the largest economy, the most industrialized economy in the world, if you look at how seriously they take the agriculture sector, yet this is the land of AI, technology, manufacturing. But if you look at how seriously they take the agriculture sector, because they know he who feeds you controls you. So it's very hard for you to sell your produce here in Kenya to the US. If you talk about like AGOA does not include agricultural. It's other items. It's your textiles, but it's not food. And we need to be very sacrosanct and be able to say we need to protect our farmers' produce, because from there on, now you can build a manufacturing sector in agro-processing.
Yeah, value add.
So if you have pineapples, I can make pineapple juice and send it. So you can value as you build many other, and you build services. So you grow the pineapples, he makes the pineapple juice, I supply it to the primary schools in the area. So we all create an economy. So agriculture is a fundamental, and we have to, if I say nothing else today, protect that sector very much.
We are headed for pure destruction.
I tend to be an agent of hope, not
Me
doom.
too, but
But we have to get it right.
But don't we have bills being passed? We had a conversation here with Kathomi,
Right.
and we were talking about the bills that have been tabled, the agriculture bills that have been tabled.
Right.
And sometimes these bills have been tabled by people who completely know, they are what we would love to openly call sponsored bills. Wow. An organization has sponsored you as a member of parliament to table a certain bill in parliament, and as you're saying, it's not going to serve us as Kenyans.
I mean, think of an entity such as CALRO, or what used to be called CARI, Kenya Agricultural Research. Now it's called CALRO. This is an entity that has been there for almost a century, with the best insights. By the way, we have some of the best agricultural economists, best agricultural experts in the world. Here in Kenya, locally trained, and have done amazing things. Like the brains we have in this country in agriculture is insane. Even things like East Coast fever, the cure for that was actually found here, very close here in Kenya. So it tells you we have the knowledge. CALRO has been there for 100 years, but that wisdom stays within the institution. It never gets to the farmer. I've never known why we don't have a budget line item for extension services. In fact, if we talk to them and ask them, how come we don't have extension services so that this wisdom gets to the local farmer? They say we don't have funding. They have to apply for funding to donors, because what they get from government is for salaries. But for extension services, which is the most critical part, so that the wisdom is transmitted to the ordinary person, it's not there unless a donor comes in and maybe gives you a 1-year program. But you can't sustain on donors. So government has to be very keen on extension services. It was so sad to see the locust people using Omo to try and take care of the locust menace that we had a couple of years ago. Yet you have institutions that have been there for a century. Best papers, the smartest PhDs in agricultural sector, but that wisdom is frustrated from getting to the ordinary people. So those are some of the hurdles that, in fact, I keep saying, after the president and the deputy, probably the most important cabinet secretary has to be either the agriculture minister, the minister of treasury, and the minister of defense. Those three are the three most critical entities of government. Yeah.
I'm also glad you touched on it. If there's anything we say today, I would also love to add my voice on that. Let's protect that sector. There is a lot of opportunities.
Absolutely.
There's so many things that we can be able to do, but is anyone listening? But moving on, we've seen a lot of companies close shop. We had Mobius, there are so many, I can't even name. We had, it's Mobius, Gabolen, so many companies that have closed shop. Is the business environment friendly to foreign investors? And why are they closing shop?
Well, I mean, you have to be able to dissect. There's no umbrella reason. Every company goes through. Because also our investors who are coming in.
Yes.
I believe there's an Australian coffee shop that will be setting up in Kenya next year. We have some new food brands that will be coming in. So they
Piers
also
Morgan is here.
absolutely JP Morgan.
Oh, sorry, JP Morgan
is
here.
coming. So we do have investors. And what makes Kenya an attractive place to invest? As I said, we have a young demographic. So these are people who are vibrant, well educated. You have well diversified. We are not like other African countries that are dependent on oil or gold. What is called the Dutch disease. They really focus on one sector. In Kenya, we are diversified. If tourism is not doing well, agriculture is doing well. If manufacturing is not doing well, another sector. Then also we have good infrastructure. Whether it's your expressway, M-Pesa, banking system, we have a good infra. So Kenya is still an attractive place. But the challenge I think companies are starting to have is our taxation system seems to be a bit challenging, not only just in terms of you paying to government as a business, but also how it's affecting your customers. So if you own a nice restaurant here in Westlands, yes, your obligations to government are going up, but also the customers who are coming, they're coming maybe 30% less. And when they come, they're not spending, maybe they used to have a bottle of wine, now they're having a soda,
Or water. Or water.
Yeah, so not only are they fewer, but even the things they are purchasing are less. So it puts you in a difficult situation where you still have to pay your VAT and your payee, but the customers are telling you they can only come, maybe if they're coming every weekend, they'll come once a month. And even then, they'll just have one or two drinks. So obviously, as a business, and you're in the business of making profit, even though you love Kenya so much, and many of these investors love Kenya, there's very few countries that can beat Kenya in terms of a good place to be. But even they start saying, it's becoming tough. Maybe we go to Tanzania, maybe go to Rwanda, but their heart is in Kenya, but still they tell you, I love Kenya, but I can't burn my capital making losses in this country. So the taxation has, we have to look at our tax policy as a country. Our tax policy is not a progressive tax policy.
And what would their exit now mean for our economy?
Well, obviously it means jobs, because when they exit, they have to lay off employees. The knowledge they had, the knowledge transfer that locals were getting from them finishes. And also now it affects future investors, because somebody sitting in New York or London saying, where do we invest next? Let's look at Kenya.
Yeah.
What are the headlines in Kenya? Companies moving out. So it also affects future investors who would have wanted to come, but when they see the headlines, the optics are very untidy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there are people who said President Ruto inherited a very struggling economy, and we must give him time to put it together. Do you think that's the truth? Do you think he's trying? Do you think this government is trying? And with the time left, how much more can be done?
Well, it's true that he inherited an economy where the debt levels were high. If you look at the debt levels under Uhuru Kenyatta's government, they went from about 1 trillion to about 7 trillion, so almost sevenfold.
Yeah.
In fact, the period under Henry Rotich, I think we borrowed more than the previous 14 ministers of finance combined. So there was a huge borrowing at that time. The thinking was, let's put it in infrastructure,
Yes.
standard gauge railway. The only problem with those sectors, they take long before they pay back. So you end up with a situation where you have a good standard gauge railway. Yes, it's safe, it's good, but it's not generating the same income that you had borrowed from the Chinese. So you end up with these pressure. And it's true that Ruto, when he came in, this was a burden that he had to take over and continue with it. The only problem is they have not tried to make it easier. If anything, our debt levels continue to go up. In fact, it's even worse now, because not only are we raising more taxes, but also we are getting deeper into debt, which is ironic, because during the campaign, the message was, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. But now we've actually dug. I think we've gone about 3 trillion deeper into debt, yet you're still raising a lot of taxes. So people start asking, so where is our taxes going? We thought we are paying higher taxes, so at least we can temporarily sort out the huge debt. But if you look at the debt levels, they're continuing to go up. So it's almost like the worst of both worlds. We have a growing debt and high taxes, and that's what has put Kenyans in between a rock and a hard place.
So is there, I know you said you're an agent of hope. Given the time remaining, I believe they've already served half of their term. Could they achieve what they promised Kenyans in this remaining couple of years?
If the desire is there, absolutely. It would mean looking at our economic policies broadly. First, dealing with our fiscal policies, where government is raising revenue. Ask ourselves, how do we collect taxes? Is it in a fair way? Are people paying their fair share? Because a good tax system, what is called a progressive tax system, it means people are paying proportionally to their station in life. In fact, what they say is, to whom much is given, much is expected. That's a good progressive tax policy. And it's fair, because if I'm a wealthy billionaire with 100,000 acres, I should be able to pay more than somebody who's unemployed. Unfortunately, we don't have that. Our laws are not very progressive. So that's number one. We need to look at expenditure of government and say, all this expenditure, how do we streamline it? And I'm not saying going the Trump way, where you appoint Elon Musk to to cut on government inefficiency, but asking, are some of these roles, can they be done by the private sector? A good example is hotels. Is there any reason today that the government should run a hotel? Absolutely not. Relinquish that to the private sector. In philosophy, we call that the principle of subsidiarity. It says what can be done by the lower body should not be done by the higher body. So in the office setup, what can be done by the intern does not be done by the officer. What can be done by the supervisor should not be done by the CEO. And that's how your entities work. What can be done by the private sector should not be done by the county. What can be done by the county should not be done by the national government. So if you look at affordable housing, housing is actually a devolved function. It belongs to the counties, but now it's the national government
doing it,
pushing it. So there are all these things that are straining the government, things that government should not be. Government should ideally be in the business of law and order, justice. These are public goods that no private entity, you, Lynn, cannot provide me justice.
Absolutely.
You cannot provide me law and order.
Yes.
You need a policeman, you need a judge. So government should be involved with the things that the private sector cannot provide. These are called public goods. Public health, making sure the markets are clean. No private sector can do that. So there are other entities, the other remaining functions. Ask, these things can be done by the private sector. Housing. Most Kenyans have said, we can actually do housing ourselves. Just give us good jobs.
But we can.
And good income.
Are they not giving that to China? Are they not giving the contracts to? We can.
That's it. And your typical Kenyan will tell you, first of all, I never voted to be given a house. Number two, I just need a good job. With a good job, I'll build a house to my tastes and to my needs. Maybe you already even have another house. So I think this lack of understanding of roles also makes the government run with so much, where it's running conference centers. Should the government be running conference centers? A private sector can run that with much more innovation. So if you do that, again, that means the expenditures go down and your deficits reduce, and you don't have to borrow so much. And when you borrow little, it means now the banks, now they don't have a market for lending to government. They have to come to Ken and Lynn
and serve their purpose.
Yeah. And now they start coming to your offices
to beg. But then you notice they don't do that anymore.
They used to do that.
Banks used to be in your offices every other time. We want to talk to your staff members. We want to tell them about our banking experience. We want to tell them why they should buy. Actually, I've gone through that, like I think twice, where the manager says, kuna watu wa bank leo wanakuja. Na munakaa hapo munaambiwa why you should bank with this bank. They don't do that anymore.
I mean, there was a time they would pitch tents outside the Jomo Kenyatta airport. You just land. All you had to say was literally, you had to show all you have was a pulse, and you'd get a loan. So it's because they had no other entity to do this. And if you do that, businesses will borrow. Your restaurant owner now will be able to have enough to expand, to hire more people. All the Gen Zs will be hired, and there'll be no need for mandamanos because everybody will be busy with a job that gives them, jobs give you hope, they give you dignity, they give you all these things, a purpose.
You are serving a purpose.
Yes.
But back on debts, I've always been fascinated. We are getting another loan by IMF, right? They've just witnessed what the country went through, and the people are saying we don't want these debts because we can't see what they do. So what is it? What's in these international bodies? Why do they keep insisting on pumping loans to a country that all went to chaos because of the same loans?
Well, the IMF and the World Bank, what we call the Bretton Woods institutions, they serve a purpose to make sure there's liquidity in the international system. And they don't force themselves, we invite them. So we need to ask our leaders, because Kibaki was very strict. He said he did not need the IMF. So leaders have a choice. So we are part of a 3-year program, which thankfully is ending next year. So right now we should say, okay, this program, we started during the Uhuru days. We had no control. Uhuru started this program with IMF, and we're in it. But it's ending next year. So we should ask ourselves, how now do we get off next year? Because what the government is planning is next year to extend the term with the IMF. Instead of asking, can we now change our direction? Can we wean ourselves off? Because the IMF will give you money, but it will come with so many conditionalities. And that's the reason African countries, in the 90s, if you remember, IMF was a big player in Kenya during the Moi days and in Africa. And most people lost jobs. Many companies were cancelled. And that's the time African leaders said, we are tired of the West. We are going to China, we're going to face East. So since the 2000s, African leaders have been getting loans from China. But that said, when COVID came, countries found themselves with a lot of debt and they needed some support. So the IMF came again and offered help, which is okay. But this idea that you have a 3-year program, now you plan to extend it.
We are actually planning to extend.
That's the thinking. It's not been committed, but already that's the hints that has been supplied that next year's will be extended. And that's not the direction. Somebody would have said, okay, COVID was a very unique situation. We needed IMF, but now we're out of COVID. We do not need to extend. What we need to do is focus on the things that we said, have a good tax policy, make sure our expenditure, we are living within our means, we are not borrowing unnecessarily, and we can get off this program. So I think that lack of desire by the leaders. So for me, I don't blame the IMF so much. The IMF is a fund. It's there to make business, to profit. They do make profit.
But don't they have a moral obligation? Don't they have, like sit down, see, this is a whole mess that came because of what you did. Why wouldn't they just step aside for a minute?
Well, they do. I mean, the meetings in October, which our leaders attended, they do have sessions where they invite African leaders and all other leaders to come and explain their case. But the fact that you're going to them for money already means that you have to be ready for their, if you didn't need their money, you would not need their advice. But the fact that you're saying, oh, we have a hole, we need money to pay contractors, we need money. So they'll tell you, okay, what are your revenue raising measures? We'll give you money, but we also need that money to be paid back. And to make sure you'll pay that money back, we want to see how you are increasing your revenue. So now the government has to come back to Kenya and start adding VAT here and there. But you're right, it needs not be that way. We have periods in Kenya where we've had minimal IMF interference because we were on top of our tax game, we were on top, we didn't borrow as much. So we were able to contain things within us. So I think the fact that we lost that path, we need to ask ourselves, how do we regain that path so that we do not sever ties, but minimize, make sure that IMF is something during periods of disaster, pandemics and wars. It should not be an everyday sort of, it should be like a land of last resort when things are almost apocalyptic.
Yeah.
But we've made IMF almost like our daily friend.
Our to go to.
And that means they send you conditionalities, not just on the finances, but on many other aspects on how you manage your economy. And sometimes those conditionalities can be very painful. So we need to rethink our economic policies and how do we wean ourselves off so we have minimal, make sure that IMF is just really the land of last resort.
Okay, and I've seen a lot of comparison between Kenya and other African countries, you know. A conversation is actually going on right now. If we don't watch out, Tanzania is going to defeat us, Rwanda is going to defeat us, Ethiopia is going to defeat us. Is there any truth to that? Where are we? Where can we position ourselves when it comes to Africa's economy?
The challenge with Tanzania is their human capital. It's not as strong. Their curriculum is not as strong as Kenya's. They're English, and you do need to have good English to integrate with the global environment.
Yes.
Is not where it needs to be. So the human capital is a bit weak. If you go to Uganda, the challenge there is the private sector is very weak. The public sector drives a lot. The military has a huge presence in the economy. So if you go to a petrol station, you'll be told it's owned by that general. If you go to a mall, it's owned by another general. So there's a military, almost industrial complex.
Okay.
If you go to Rwanda, very promising country, innovative, but Rwanda is tiny. It's the size of Nairobi. So it's very promising, good policies, but it's tiny, but also its democratic credentials are not very clear. People ask after Kagame, what will happen? And if you go to Ethiopia, huge economy, most populous people, but no private sector. Private sector is just starting. It's almost been driven by the public sector. It's only now banks thinking of private ownership, telcos, but all these things used to be run by the state, which is where Kenya was almost 30, 40 years ago. So Kenya has that advantage that we have a visible private sector, there is strong enforcement, we have a good justice system. I mean, we've had a Supreme Court nullify a presidential election. We have democratic gains. You know, I was talking to a Ugandan who was looking at Kenyan social media, and he was asking, how is that even possible that you guys can have that kind of discourse? In Uganda, it's not even possible. And you have freedom, you have good, good weather. I mean, Ugandans love coming to Kenya for events in Malindi, events. I mean, these countries follow Kenyan politics like money. The way you follow American politics, they follow our politics. So Kenya has still a pedestal, but again, as I said, to whom much is given,
much
is expected. Despite our profile, I don't think we're doing enough to justify why we need to be on a higher pedestal, because the region has put you as a pedestal, but you know, if you look at how our leaders exchange words, it doesn't inspire confidence. So Kenya still has an opportunity, but with the privilege comes responsibility. And unfortunately, I don't think we take our responsibilities as much as we enjoy our privilege. Because in Kenya, let's say we're the biggest in East and Central Africa. But you don't ask yourself, so what's the responsibility tied to that? Does it mean as a business, I need to have better corporate standards so that other economists, when they come to Kenya, they say, now that's a real economist. But you don't find that responsibility attached to that privilege. And I think that's the challenge. We have good privilege, but we don't utilize also the responsibilities.
Still on hope, maybe before we wind up, what are the 3 things maybe we should do as a country if we want to see ourselves grow? I know you touched on agriculture, protecting the agricultural sector. Could you add 2?
Well, I think from the public sector is making sure that we take a look at corruption, because people throw that word that every day 2 billion shillings is stolen. And maybe it's just a common phrase, but we need to think deeply about how is this robbing our economy, because that money could be put in healthcare, we put in education. So this idea that the Kenyans who go to Dubai every Friday and come back every Sunday on public money, that idea needs to be explored and cut down. I think if we can kill corruption and have good public servants prudently managing our resources, that's good. Then we need to look at our key sectors, agriculture, our policies for production, or our policies hurting production. I think that's a very critical area. Surprisingly, justice again, because our justice system needs funding. The judiciary say they need about 25% of the budget to be able to do a good job, because right now, even around in Westlands, you'll find so many idle properties because there's some fight between
legal
families
battles.
and these legal battles can take 20, 30 years. Think of the lost rent, the lost jobs.
Oh, have
the
you
lost
seen the property by Red Hill? I've always wondered what happened to such beautiful houses. You know, you pass there every time and you are like, what is going on, you know?
What's happening there is what's happening in almost every urban sector, whether it's commercial property, residential property. Think of how many home moments have been lost because of that. So the justice system, we have to really make sure we have a good funding of our justice system, so that contract enforcement, right now we are hearing of cartels stealing land, land grabbing. These are things that an investor hears and they just like, get mortified, because you come, you set up a property only to be told, oh, that title deed you bought was fake. Then we need to start using technology, things like blockchain. Blockchain can help us with our real estate, for example. When you think of blockchain, everybody thinks of Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, but blockchain can be applied on real estate, where if you have a title deed and you have a land and you sell it to me, it's updated in every database in the world. So the idea that you and I can be fighting, it's not possible. It's either yours or it's mine. There's no avenue for in between. In Kenya, there's a lot of in-betweens, and and that land is a factor of production. So when land is idle, it means production is not happening. So we need to also fund our judiciary. We need to give them a good budget so cases are expedited. We're using technology to resolve cases. I think if we can do those things, and obviously our curriculum, education system, we move to CBC, we need to see, is it competitive? Are we, in the next 10 years, is it going to produce the next level of Ivy League graduates?
I want to be hopeful with you on that, but all signs indicate to a very big no. Yeah, I want to be hopeful with you, Ken, but all signs towards CBC just indicate.
No, that's a challenge. So those are a couple of things.
That's a huge challenge.
Very, because human capital, as I said, is our competitive advantage. We don't have gold, we don't have oil. So the quality of our people is what makes us competitive. So any curriculum change in Kenya will have more impact than in other countries where they have gold and oil and natural wealth. In Kenya, we really depend on the quality of our people. So we have to be absolutely sure that we are raising the most productive group of Africans in this part of the world.
I love that. What 2 books would you recommend for our audience?
From economics or generally speaking?
Choose any can do.
Well, I think there's a great book called Small is Beautiful. That's Ernest Schumacher. I think that's a book, it's actually written in the 70s, in the 80s, but speaks of the principle of what I said earlier, where government limiting what it can do and allowing private sector to be able to grow. I think a second book would be on individuals' competitiveness, principles of highly effective people. Because yes, you can be in a tough time economic-wise, but as an individual, you can choose to be competitive, you can choose to be productive, and still thrive.
I love that.
Yeah.
And we saw that also a lot during COVID.
Absolutely.
Some people actually became really competitive during that time.
Absolutely.
And they thrived.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't want to let you go. Maybe if there is anything that you feel we've left out, please feel free to touch on it, as you also tell our people how can they be able to connect with you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on this show. Feel free to reach me on my X account. That's at kgishinga. You can also send us an email to Mentoria. That's info@mentoria.co.ke. If you have any need for economic insights, strategy, we'll be more than willing to support you.
Good. That's it?
That's it.
You're good?
Very good.
All right. As we've said, it's time for us to have these conversations. You've said this is now the age of us going deeper and understanding. I'm loving this time because now it's not about politics. It's not about tribal sijui what. It's not about people trying to divide us based on where you come from. It's about it's that time where we get to understand how our economy works, and it's a very good opportunity to have people like you in. Yeah, it's a blessing to have people like you in our country.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about, we've had political independence.
Yes.
Now we need economic independence.
Yeah. Oh, what do you think the next stage will be? That would be 2050?
I think it will be more of identity issues. What the US is going through now.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be more of identity, cultural identity. I think that's the next
one
that our children now will have to define for themselves. But I think it will be a social, cultural identity situation, because we'll be so diverse. So people will start asking various things about our diversity. Yes. I think that will be the next
one.
Yeah, but those are things that anchored when you have a good economy. Yeah.
Beautiful. Oh, guys, I believe we've learned a thing or two. Remember, we are also in our season of learning and relearning what we've been taught before. And as always, I can't wait for your feedback on the comment section. I appreciate also your feedback on our conversation with our Professor Fadel. That was an amazing conversation. So if you've not watched it, please go watch. I love that you are also telling us what you think we should be able to cover next. Remember, sometimes I curate conversations based on your feedback. So feel free to leave your feedback on the comment section, and also connect with our guest. The handles are on the screen right now. His email will also be pinned on the comment section. And a huge thank you to our partners at Kings Developers Limited. Do check them out for all your real estate needs. If you're looking into owning an apartment, check them out. The details are on your screen. Also, don't feel shy. Let us know who else you would love us to have on the show. And I've said, if there's anything you can't leave on the comment section, our email is there for you, info@lnn.digital. How about I see you guys tomorrow at 7 p.m. Bye-bye.